There are productive ways of responding and expressing those frustrations, and there are destructive ways of responding. Burning buildings, torching cars, destroying property, putting people at risk, that's destructive, and there's no excuse for it.
President Obama trying repeatedly this week to put a lid on the anger that erupted across the country after the grand jury decided not to bring charges against the Ferguson police officer. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Kimberly Strassel from the Wall Street Journal, Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press, the Washington Post, Robert Costa, and Bob Woodward, also from the Washington Post. Julie, let's start with that infamous split screen from the night of the non-indictment, and the picture on the one side of President Obama urging calm, and on the other side of the streets of Ferguson erupting. How much hand-wringing was there at the White House after the fact about putting the president out so that that split screen, that juxtaposition could be seen?
Well, I think the response that you saw from them was to have him go out and speak again on Tuesday, the clip that you just played. It was interesting the day that this indictment came down, or that the non-indictment came down, the White House really wanted the president to be out there. They kept reporters at the White House late. It's very unusual for him to speak that late into the evening. They wanted him to have a presence on this, and yet it created these awkward optics where you had the president calling for calm at the same time that you're seeing unrest. And they felt, though, that he needed to go back out again the next day. I actually think his remarks on Tuesday were much stronger because you actually knew how the situation had played out. It was difficult just moments after we knew what had happened from this grand jury for him to say something that really meant something, because we just didn't know yet how this was going to play out.
It wasn't just the president who came up for some criticism. We asked you for questions for the panel, and we got a lot of questions about media coverage. Take a look at this one. Ellen Canavan asked on Facebook, did wall-to-wall coverage help encourage outrageous behavior? And Matthew Murray sent this on Twitter. I know it is news, but some of the coverage seemed to be rooting for the worst. When did tabloid mentality become the norm? Bob, good questions. How do you answer? Bob Costa, how do you answer Ellen and Matthew?
Well, I think the media criticism is somewhat fair. Perhaps it was a bit heavy, but I think when you look at people like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, when you look at the Washington Post coverage, it has been solid throughout. And when it comes to timing, I think the blame perhaps could be on how the prosecutor handled this, the timing of the announcement of the grand jury at night. That seemed to provoke a lot of interest and questions about timing. But I think the media coverage has been pretty deep, looking at the family, looking at the consequences, not only within the town, but nationally, politically.
I suppose part of the question is you put on TV lights, you put on the cameras, they're there, and you're going to attract a crowd.
You are, and we saw that one burning car certainly got a lot of coverage on that one evening. But this is a major issue. It's a tragedy what happened to Mr. Brown, and I think this is causing a lot of discussion around the country about race, about politics, about even the media. And I think the media has been subject to some unfair criticism for going overboard when this is become a national issue.
I want to talk about that now, the bigger picture, Bob, because we've seen this before. We saw it, for instance, in Los Angeles after the verdict exonerating, the first verdict exonerating the police officers in the Rodney King beating, and then there were terrible riots there. What do you take as the lesson here about tensions, not just in Ferguson, but generally between the police departments and the black communities where they enforce the law?
There's always going to be criticism, but the media always has to cover it. And
but I'm not asking about the media. I'm asking about the tensions between the black community and the police.
Well, then you need to dig into and do stories about that. I think what's really interesting here is that the prosecutor put out all the grand jury testimony. And when you look at it, it is hopelessly contradictory. And he let people, hey, look, this is what we based our decision on.
Some people said he was shot in the back. Some people said he was giving up. Some people said he was charging like a bull.
I mean, it is a classic case of, you know, how do you find out what happened? And they didn't, and so we're seeing this all play out. But I think that's fine. I think actually what Obama had to say was sensible and reasonable, and the issue here is the racial division in this country, which still exists, which everyone needs to address. A case like this inflames it and focuses it, of course, but you can't walk away from that.
You know, the racial divisions do exist, and one of the and persist. And one of the things, Kim, that was so striking was the tremendously different reactions in the white community and the black community to this. I mean, the forensic evidence, at least in terms of what went on inside that car, all backed Officer Wilson's story. Clearly, Rodney Wilson's DNA was inside. It was on Officer Wilson's body. It was on the gun. It seemed there clearly was a struggle that went on inside there. One can argue about whether Wilson should have gotten out. There's no question that the big threat to the black community is from other blacks. I found out this week the #1 cause of homicide in the black community between young blacks ages 15 to 34 is homicide.
Right.
Homicide. But yet it all goes out the window when one of these cases happens.
I think this is where there is some culpability in the White House, in that I agree with Bob. The president has said all the right things this week once the grand jury decision was handed down. I think one of the questions, though, was leading up to it, in particular, Eric Holder's decision to launch his own investigation into the Wilson action and on a civil rights potential case, which is a very high bar, as you heard, to do a separate probe into whether the actions of the entire Ferguson Police Department, to run their own autopsy. All of that led to the impression from the start that there was something not fair or right or suspect about what was going on in the justice system in Ferguson. And that has allowed a lot of people, a lot of the protesters, to come out and say, and you get these very varied actions, like reactions, as you were saying. A lot of people just think that this was a sham from the beginning, and no matter what the evidence says, that is not breaking through. And I do think that that was a problem. And the president ought to also be talking about those issues that you mentioned. I mean, the black-on-black crime in the community is one of the hugest issues out there.
All right. We have to take a break here.